Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kateri Callahan, and I have the distinct honor of serving as the president of the Alliance to Save Energy, which is an NGO based here in Washington, D.C., that has been dedicated for nearly 4 decades to advancing energy efficiency. So you can imagine my delight when the good folks at BPC asked me to come over and lead a panel that's going to explore energy efficiency in the context of Section 111D and using it as a compliance strategy. I think it's fair to say that energy efficiency advocates across the United States are really chomping at the bit in hopes that Section 111D guidelines coming out from EPA are going to be a real driver and help us to deploy energy efficiency broadly across the United States. And I think it's probably fair as well for the countless number of businesses that are involved and engaged in energy efficiency, whether that's in the built environment, whether it's in transportation or in the industrial arena, also are looking to these new regulations as a possible mechanism for taking energy efficiency to scale in this country. We are departing a bit from the type of panel that you've seen earlier in the day, and again, I think that this speaks to energy efficiency and its broad reach across all sectors of our economy and all levels of government. And today, on our panel to explore the opportunities and challenges for using energy efficiency as part of the Section 111D strategy, we have with us 3 very impressive panelists that bring very diverse perspectives. So instead of a panel of air regulators, instead of a panel of energy efficiency advocates, you're going to get a mix of, I think, very representative of the kinds of stakeholders that are going to need to come together and work with EPA and work with the states if we are to advantage energy efficiency. So I'm delighted to introduce them to you briefly before we start the discussion. We first have with us Asim Haq, who is a relatively newly appointed regulator. He is from Ohio Public Utility Commission. He was appointed by Governor Kasich in 2013. So he's got a little over a year, I think, under his belt right now. But Asim comes very well prepared to the job. He is an attorney by education. He practiced law, specializing in the utility and energy sector. And I think importantly, his leadership as a regulator is very informed by the clients that he served, which were a wide array of cities, of competitive retailers, and of businesses and interest groups. So he came with I think, a very broad-based perspective. We are also delighted to have with us Diane Munns. I think many of you in the room know her. She brings kind of all the perspectives embodied in one person. She spent 2 decades as a regulator, 2 terms as chair of NARUC. Leaving there, she went on to be part of the trade association, the Edison Electric Institute for investor-owned utilities, and led their retail services business. Then she went on from there to actually be part of a regulated utility at Mid-American, where she did regulatory affairs and energy efficiency. And now she's come full circle, and I would say she's gone with the angels and works at an NGO at the Environmental Defense Fund, running their Clean Power initiative. And then finally, wrapping up in terms of the intros, we have Gene Rodriguez. Gene has, I think, again, a face probably largely familiar to many of you here. He has overseen, and just until January of this year, oversaw one of the largest energy efficiency programs in the country at Southern California Edison. And he really is a true energy efficiency champion. He's been proselytizing on energy efficiency through roles with the Consortium for Energy Efficiency, through our sister organization, ACEEE, and through leadership roles at the Alliance to Save Energy. So we've got a regulator, we've got a regulated, formally. He's now with ICF, but so close to Southern California Edison, we're going to still consider him a regulated representative voice here. And then we have Diane Munns, again, who embodies many of those voices all coming together. So I'm looking forward to a robust conversation, and we decided to put the regulator on the hot seat. He's the new kid on the block up here, and we thought it would be, seriously thought that it would be a good perspective to ask him first what, as a regulator, he would like to see in EPA's guidelines on Section 111D, what he'd like to see that would help to advance energy efficiency and clean energy in his state of Ohio, and I think as importantly, what he doesn't want to see and what could impede progress in those areas. So I want to ask him that question. I also would ask him, Asim, if you would, just to give people a little bit of a background, talk about where you are with respect to energy efficiency programs in the state currently. Many of you may know that there's some potential changes in those programs, at least being expressed this week. We'll talk about that later. I don't want to get into a discussion of what the programs may look like in the future, but now, what do they look like now, and how does that inform what you would like to see EPA do with the guidelines and what you'd like to see them not do?
Thanks, Kateri, and good afternoon, everybody. The first thing I'd like to do is thank the Bipartisan Policy Center for putting this program, and in particular this panel, together. I'm very pleased to be here and to represent the Buckeye State. So the first thing that I'll do is lay out how really our energy efficiency program and a few other initiatives work, and then as Kateri said, from a state regulator standpoint, discuss my concerns with the EPA 111 guidelines, potential concerns going forward. So Ohio has an energy efficiency initiative. This initiative requires a 22% reduction of electricity consumption by 2025, and annual benchmarks are set so that it is a gradual climb up to that 22%. Baselines were established by each company in 2009. Portfolio plans are filed every 3 years, and on an annual basis, there are compliance filings that our electric companies file as well. Now, in order to receive credit for an energy efficiency project, in order to meet those benchmarks, an electric company, a mercantile customer, or both jointly can file an application with the commission. Once the commission analyzes the application, sees that it meets statutory and regulatory parameters, the commission will approve the application, and that application is effectively then sent to an independent consultant who performs the evaluation, measurement, and verification, or the EM&V, for that particular project. To date, over 2,000 applications have been filed with the Ohio Commission, and our electric companies are hitting their annual benchmarks. Through more recent legislation, combined heat and power systems, as well as waste energy recovery systems, can also be included in those benchmarks that have to be met on an annual basis. That's really the core of our energy efficiency program in Ohio. I just want to briefly mention we also have a peak demand reduction initiative, which is a 7.75% reduction in peak demand by 2018. We also have an alternative energy initiative, which requires that 25% of our electric company's sales come from alternative energy resources by 2025, half from what we call advanced sources, which include advances in clean coal technology, and half from renewables. And I bring up Ohio's programs specifically, but these programs are my understanding. Many states have implemented similar programs across the country. So hopefully my concerns are also shared by those states as well. And so now specifically for my concerns about the treatment of, we'll really specifically talk about, since this is the energy efficiency panel, energy efficiency by the EPA in its upcoming guidelines. And hopefully it could be the start of of a good conversation with our experts, Ms. Munns and Mr. Rodriguez, whom I'm honored to share the stage with today. So 3 concerns that I'll bring up. The first concern, we'd request from the EPA that the savings from our energy efficiency initiative be recognized and credited in our state implementation plan that we submit, and that is both past savings as well as future savings. Second, regarding evaluation, measurement, and verification, we'd request that the EPA be deferential to states that have programs in place and have been performing EM&V for some years now. And I can get into some specifics of how that works. Again, that's an independent consultant that conducts that EM&V but we request that the EPA be deferential to states with EM&V for states that have these programs. Finally, and this may not be the right venue with this panel, but we do have a jurisdictional concern that if we include our energy efficiency program within a state implementation plan, what are sort of the jurisdictional considerations for the future if in the event, and many of you that sort of monitor what happens state by state have an understanding that our legislature right now is analyzing whether or not to freeze these benchmarks. And so that's a separate conversation altogether. I have nothing to do with what the legislature decides at the end of the day, but that is a conversation that's being had right now. So it's a jurisdictional issue. And so with that, those are the concerns about our energy efficiency initiative in conjunction with EPA 111D from the state of Ohio.
Great. So let me then move to the regulated representative here, in Jean Rodriguez. So Jean, I heard 3 concerns here that I'd like you to comment on if you see fit, that savings be recognized, past and future, and be credited. EM&V needs to be left to the states. EPA should be deferential there. And then the jurisdictional concern of the PUC, if I understand this correctly, PUC being putting programs in place, someone else, the air regulators, regulating those, but then the underlying legislature changing the rules. I also, from a regulated entity, if there are concerns or guidance to EPA you'd like to give, I'd invite you to do that in your opening comment here.
Thank you. Small question to start off. Thanks, Kateri. So let me broaden it even further. So let me take it not just from the perspective of someone who blossomed under regulation for a great many years, but in my current role at ICF International, we work with all kinds of clients and stakeholders in this efficiency business. So I'm going to try to measure and marry together the concerns of the regulated entities and the regulators as well as I answer this. The excellent news in this is those are 3 very common sense and I would say insightful concerns, but efficiency has an answer for each and every one of them. So let's start off with the first. The first issue raised was if and to what extent are we going to count existing energy efficiency efforts as part of the compliance that comes forth under 111D. And while this is at its heart a policy question, and a policy judgment will be made by that, I would argue as we sit there, those people who have worked in efficiency for 20-odd years now can make this point. It's easy to look around the country and find a tremendous body of evidence that efficiency persists. Because it's common sense, isn't it? Energy efficiency at its core is replacing inefficient technology and substituting a more efficient technology. The engineers in the room will say, well, then it becomes a simple math problem. We can figure out the estimated useful life of these items. We can figure out how many went in, that's just counting. And then you just do the multiplication, do the addition, and you can figure that out. So I would argue that in each individual state that has done any energy efficiency whatsoever, you're going to find a body of evidence that can tell you an awful lot about the persistence, the engineering reality of energy efficiency. However, to my friends in the regulatory arena, I would say that the perfect answer is going to come when the folks who are, the great number of people here from NARUC, when they do the sharing of best practices and information that's been gathered around the country. The good news with energy efficiency is that when it started off, there was a concern among the engineering types in the utility industry that these Birkenstock-wearing hippies were going to come in and do all this wild-eyed stuff. Instead, what happened is what you found is people who know how to use a sharp pencil and who know engineering reality in the real world came in to the efficiency space and have created a body of work that proves up the reality of efficiency, its persistence, and the fact that it can be counted on in long-term resource planning. So that will be useful in answering your concern, first concern. Second, you talked about, I think, again, another very insightful concern about let's make sure that this flexibility that we've bantered about so far includes some deference to existing measurement and evaluation approaches being used and frameworks being used in various states. I think that's an absolute common sense request, and I would recommend that to EPA. But by way of friendly amendment, let me push you a half step further. There's one thing that I would warn all of the regulators in the room, and precious few people with the exception of Commissioner Fox, who has seen both sides of the equation, recognize this. The people who've been working in energy efficiency, the energy side, the economic regulation side, we don't have it exactly right in measurement and evaluation. We don't have it exactly right for the expansion that can and should come with using energy efficiency as a least cost, advantaged approach to making GHG emission reductions. What we have done wrong is we created an avoided cost type of technology, a benefit cost ratio type approach. What we have failed to do, though, is recognize that in the case of climate, in the case of GHG emission reductions, the avoided marginal resource isn't some hypothetical CCGT sitting out there with perfect access to fuel and perfect access to transmission to get it out there. It is what would it otherwise cost the utilities and other folks in this room to be able to comply with their GHG emission reduction requirements. I would argue, strike that. I would point out what's going to be obvious. Just as we found with using energy efficiency as a resource to be part of integrated resource plans that have both economic and environmental attributes that are worthy of pursuit, we're going to find that in the GHG emission realm, the amount of efficiency that we can go after more cost effectively than other options to us is going to be magnified multifold. And I would ask that each regulator in the room, as they look for what is cost effective or do the scenarios, as Bob Balzar would say, around what we could do and what strategies we could take, do not be bound by the old thinking about what cost effectiveness means. Let's start to look at what is truly the marginal option here and let efficiency battle it out in the court of economics. I think we'll find that more efficiency will be done than has been done in the past. And the last question is the jurisdictional one, which I think is what everyone's been very polite about so far today. We started off hearing about friendly federalism. We then moved to we need some kind of a cordial and collaborative cooperation and coordination between economic regulation and environmental regulation. And I agree with all of those things. But Diane and I were talking before we came out here. There's one place you can look for a perfect example of this, and that is the community of energy efficiency. The energy efficiency community is a place where best practices have been shared from city to city, from state to state, across the entirety of the country. In fact, the EPA and DOE's National Action Plan for Energy Efficiency and State Energy Efficiency Action Network are built on the notion of sharing best practices. So again, on your third issue about how do we get around some of the jurisdictional tangles, at some point, part of that is about regulation and some of that is about policy. Mm-hmm. But I would argue around efficiency, we have proven that you can marry these kinds of concerns together and do so in a way that makes tremendous impact.
Great. Thanks, Gene. Always thought-provoking. One of the things that you mentioned was this notion of best practices and sharing as a key underlying pillar to being able to drive energy efficiency. Yeah. So, Diane, it strikes me you're in a very good spot. You were a part of NAPI, part of the origins of that, and now the Sea Action Network, and have dealt with all these stakeholders. So can you talk a bit about what are those best practices? How can they be shared effectively? Because we don't have a lot of time here. And then I think also shared practices will still run into the walls and the mountains, if you will, of regional differences in the United States with the energy picture. So I'd also, I think, like your perspective, if you're in a position to give that, of how do best practices make it over those hurdles of the differences in the energy situation in regional parts of the country, and how do we really make those applicable nationwide?
Well, and I think this question goes to one of the excellent questions posed here is giving credit to the states. And I know that leads to the issue around energy efficiency, that this is about greenhouse gas emission reductions. That's what 111D is about. So how can we be sure that these energy efficiency savings actually result in those greenhouse gas emission reductions? I think one of the things I want to talk about is we've been doing this now for a while, and I'm not sure that everybody realizes that. In some states across the country, in California, for what, 30 years, 30-some
Absolutely.
years?
Yes.
Other states, 30 years. But if you look across the country, there was a very big surge in efficiency about 10 years ago, and we've had adoption of energy efficiency resource standards, programs, and how has that been done? It's been done with this legion of contractors, like the one that Jean works for, that have essentially taken those best practices from a lot of experience in energy efficiency and taken those across the country in setting up these programs and implementing these programs. We use the same set of evaluators. There again is a legion of evaluators with best practices that go in. It's done with more rigor some places, a little less rigor other places, but the basic foundation for how it's done, I would say, is consistent.
Absolutely.
Across the United States. And while that was happening, we also had the EPA and the DOE stepping in with the National Action Plan for Energy Efficiency, now the Sea Action Network, working with regulators and companies and everyone who delivers these programs across the country to make sure we all understood what it was that we were doing. And they have developed and published all kinds of informative information that is relied on how is it that we go about doing this. The ARA money came, the stimulus money came, and it supported capacity building at commissions. With respect to energy efficiency, so that we would have more of that there. The RGGI, the multi-state, values efficiency, so we have that experience. Within several of the RTOs, they allow bidding in of efficiency and demand response, so we have that experience to draw on. As far as regulators are coming together on a regional basis through things like the organization of MISO states and PJM, so they have that foundation. And we have a tremendous amount of data collection that has been ongoing from the installation of all of these measures across the United States and the tremendous growth in doing efficiency, that we understand what kinds of savings these measures produce and the perseverance for those measures. And I think that's a message that we need to be bringing forward, which is we know how to do this and it's based on best practices.
That's great. Okay, so the utilities know how to do it. It's based on best practices. Can you give your comments on how does that stack up against having states do programs? And because many states, that's where that there are state-led initiatives, or an organization has been created, a quasi-utility created by the state to put in place energy efficiency, demand-side management programs. So can you give a comment as to which of those are better, if one or the other, and what are the differences and upsides, downsides? Jean, you want to take that one first?
I have a one-word answer for which one is better, and that is yes.
Yes.
The truth of the matter is there have been a great number of people in this country, the folks at the Regulatory Assistance Project, the people at organizations like the Alliance to Save Energy and others, who have wrestled with this question, what's the best way to do energy efficiency? And just as we heard this morning about the need for flexibility to recognize, as you were indicating earlier, to recognize the need for local concerns, local needs, and local planning to be while maybe not at the steering wheel of this, but to have a voice in how we move ahead. We've seen that every single model, every single administrative structure for doing energy efficiency has been wildly successful. So what we do need is I think, twofold. Kind of on the oversight side of it, you need some level of certainty. All business abhors uncertainty. And if you think about the energy efficiency business, you're asking people who actually deliver efficiency to set up shop and hire people and to do efficiency in a local jurisdiction or a state or a region. If you're a utility doing long-term resource planning, you need to be able to count on the ability to fund these programs over a long period of time. If you are an air regulator trying to figure out whether or not your SIP is going to endure or not, you need to have some certainty about the horizon around which efficiency will go. So I would say that on the administrative side of things, some level of certainty, some level of commitment is what's truly required. On the delivery side of it, we've already said that every model can deliver tremendous savings. I would only add that the thing that becomes important is we need to figure out what the true economics are that we're looking for. And like Diane, we're two sides of the same coin on this one. You will not be able to get the two of us to shut up about how well we've proven the value of efficiency. All we really need to know is what is the policy construct we're working under. Is it least cost energy provision? Is it demand reduction? Is it job creation? Is it GHG emission reduction? Efficiency can compete in each and every one of those policy constructs. So that's all you need to figure out is once you figure that out, we can figure out what the economic potential for efficiency is and then let the market pursue it.
Do either one of you want to make a comment on this?
I agree with
Okay,
what,
yeah.
Yeah, I guess I would just, it seems to me that with respect to the first concern that states be able to, within their state implementation plans, include their energy efficiency savings, both past and future. It doesn't sound to me that either of you disagree with that concept. And so with respect to the EM&V issue, I think what it sounds like to me is we've got there are, energy efficiency has proven itself, there are best practices out there, national best practices out there. And so my understanding is that there are a number of different EM&V methodologies or mechanisms that can be utilized. And so would those best practices that you're talking about encompass all of these sort of nationally recognized EM&V procedures? And so as long as you're within this broad spectrum or broad realm of EM&V procedures that are nationally accepted. So I just want to be clear, are we talking about one best practice, or are we talking about sort of the array of potential EM&V options that are available to you out there?
That's a fabulous question, and it allows me to give a shout out to some folks who probably aren't in the room. But since we were talking earlier this morning about this notion of the state and the federal government working together, this is an area where under the state energy efficiency, or it's actually state and local government energy efficiency action network, EPA and DOE have collected together not just the one best practice or what someone from California or someone from New Jersey or somewhere someone else would say the best practice are, collected together the best practices from around the country and put it together in what's called the Uniform Methods Project. Mm-hmm. And the great insight around UMP, they need a better acronym, I think.
No, it's the start of baseball season. It's
oh, there
perfect.
you go, yeah.
It's perfect.
That's exactly right. Just as an umpire in baseball helps to figure out what's a home run and what's not, in this case, every state regulator here, every air regulator can come together by just looking to see what's already been collected. And from there, the whole notion of the action network is to connect people with the experts from this jurisdiction, that jurisdiction, and help to get energy efficiency understanding, to Diane's point, up to the level that will give us greater assurance that the results are real.
So that's leads exactly to where I wanted to go with the next question. You said that we've got all this body of evidence and we've got this great knowledge of understanding of what energy efficiency can deliver, and we've got great confidence in it. Well, the we isn't the air regulators, it's utilities and their regulators, which are the utility commissions. And I'm wondering, in your perspective, how do you see the learning, the understanding, the confidence translating from this one set of regulatory bodies to the other? Because it will be the air regulators, as I understand it, writing the SIPs. So comments on that, maybe Awesome?
I guess what I would say is that we are working collaboratively, and you've heard that concept espoused many times this morning, with our Environmental Protection Agency within the state of Ohio. So there will be no surprises. We both know sort of where we're coming from with particular concerns and particular issues. It's not to say that there are differences, but the reality is when we get together and we talk and we share some of our concerns, neither of us really know what's going to happen and what to expect. And I think what we've resolved to do is once June hits and the guidelines are rolled out, we can collaboratively look at them and say, okay, here's what we need to do. That does not mean that there won't be a difference in philosophy, though.
And I wonder, I appreciate that, and I wonder if between now and June, in a couple of months, is there work going on to make sure that, assuming the rules come out with flexibility, that air regulators may be inclined to at least listen to having energy efficiency be a specific, if not the pivotal and key, strategy for compliance. Do either of you have a comment on that?
Yeah, I do think we need to do a better job of education as to how this is all set up. How do those protocols work? How do I know that that light bulb, that CFL or that LED light bulb that's screwed in is going to actually deliver the savings that we think it's going to deliver? And I do think that we have the evidence and the information that shows how that goes from screwing in the light bulb to delivering those savings. And not just the savings, but at what time of day are those savings dependent on the type of equipment or the type of efficiency. When are those savings delivered? And we need to educate and show people what's behind the curtain on energy efficiency so that they can look at it and say, oh, now I understand how it is you do that and how this becomes a resource that we can actually monetize and use in meeting greenhouse gas emission reduction requirements.
I would only add, I'm in absolute agreement with Diane on this. I think in the efficiency space, we've been too aw shucks for too long. We've been doing it and talking about the moral imperative to do efficiency, et cetera. In the end, it's an industry backed by hard science. It's an industry based on engineering reality. It's an industry that actually does work in the marketplace. It saves people money. It does all these things. We need to get a little louder about educating everyone else, and including and especially the air quality regulation community, about the abilities of this industry.
Okay, so we have a question from the audience, which is one that I wanted to get back to that both Asim and I think, foreshadowed, and that is, it goes to the jurisdictional point. So what happens if, the way that the questioner asked the question, is what happens if a state compliance plan includes various energy efficiency policy and another entity, and in this case the state legislature, eliminates or overturns that policy? We can imagine, for instance, in Ohio, that includes the state's RPS, the state legislature has now proposed to freeze both the renewable energy and to freeze the energy efficiency levels, I think at 4.2%. How do you replace those emissions reductions or get them? And I assume they mean under Section 111D. Let me say before you answer that, that we've been talking about this, there are more than half of the states that have energy efficiency resource standards or requirements for utilities to meet part of their demand with energy efficiency in place now. Indiana took a pause in its program, signed into law by the governor last week or the week before. Ohio has a piece of legislation that could come up for consideration this week that again would put a pause in that program, freeze it, and do a study about the program before moving forward. There may be as many as half a dozen other states that are there. So this is not just a question for Ohio, though it's posed here to the regulator, but I think it's more broadly a question as we move forward and states are beginning to take looks at their existing energy efficiency resource standards.
Yeah, so there are a number of points to hit on with respect to this question. And I would say, first of all, it is in fact reality that the Ohio legislature is considering freezing the benchmarks where they are right now. I think from my seat, again, I cannot opine about that outcome. What I would say is that in the event that they are frozen, there will still be savings, both past and future, that could be incorporated into the state implementation plan. Also, having said that, by freezing the end-use benchmarks doesn't necessarily sort of eviscerate energy efficiency from within the borders of the state of Ohio. Gene and I were joking about this. I don't think that if these are frozen, consumers, manufacturers, Ohio's a manufacturing-heavy state, and our residential consumers are going to start, running 75 applications in their home at one time because the energy efficiency benchmarks are frozen. I don't think that's how it works. It's all tied to the affordability of their bills at the end of the day, and I still think energy efficiency will be sought in the state of Ohio. Now, having said that, with respect to the jurisdictional concern, I'm a lawyer, but I haven't practiced law in maybe under a year now, and so I can't give you the definitive, here's how I think it can be structured so that we maintain jurisdiction over our program. What I can do is just prescribe a particular outcome that I hope, which is what I'm hopeful for is in the event that we're able to continue to utilize energy efficiency through a legislative mechanism that we can effectively plug the number into a state implementation plan. In the event that that number cannot be achieved because of legislative action, my hopeful outcome is that the EPA would say, okay, we are not taking jurisdiction over your program, and I don't even know if that's on the table. Again, this is just a concern or a thought, but you have to sort of backstop that with some other savings, in some other way. So, again, we'd have concerns if the EPA were able to assert jurisdiction over the program, but our hopeful sort of outcome of this is that the EPA would say, all right, no jurisdiction, but you've got to backstop this somehow.
Yeah. Okay, good. You all want to make a comment?
So the only comment I have is in going forward, I think if a state legislature were to do that, they would take away one of their most effective and flexible tools for meeting these greenhouse gas emission reductions. And I think that you are going to see going forward, if that's taking place right now, as people see how really valuable these investments and how they can help in mitigating some of the cost of doing this, in that what we can deliver a lot of these reductions at through energy efficiency, that they will re-engage and find that this is a successful tool and that they don't want to take it off the table.
Yeah, and I would just follow up on that and say that, you're hopeful that the correct sort of cost analyses are being conducted. The cost of freezing the benchmarks where they are versus the potential cost or hit to consumers in the event that they could have been utilized, the future savings could have been utilized in the 111D plan. Again, I'm not part of that calculus, but you hope that that is occurring because at the end of the day, I'm not an advocate anyway. It's similar to what my colleagues have already said: reliability, affordability, safety. From my perspective, at the end of the day.
So let's talk about this cost issue, because there are a lot of organizations that are doing economic modeling and they're making different predictions about the impact of 111D regulation and the cost of energy efficiency measures. So can you give your thoughts in terms of if we're going to look at cost of compliance in other ways versus cost of compliance with energy efficiency? You said there are all these great models, but so let's talk about what you believe are the general assumptions that should be made on the cost of energy efficiency, the lifespan of the investments, and whether and how much maybe how much demand reduction can we expect, and how does that endure? So a lot bundled up in that, but essentially at its core is what are your recommendations for best practices in cost modeling on energy efficiency, and how's that going to stack up to other compliance strategies? Gene?
Yeah, Kateri starts off with me because she knows I started off both as an attorney and an attorney working in integrated resource planning at a utility, which makes me the most boring man in the room. But I will say that there are a couple of things that jump to mind. Number one, timing is everything. So if you're thinking about dancing, comedy, or regulation, timing makes all the difference in the world. As we sit here today, none of us really knows exactly what the compliance obligations will be. There are some people who hope and some people who worry, but nobody knows what the compliance obligations will be. As those become more clear, a little more granular, then you can do exactly what you were talking about, which is you start to figure out, we had a little lesson earlier today about the difference between scenarios and strategies, right? When the scenarios start to become clear, then you can start looking at your strategies, and it becomes a math problem. And at that juncture, when the real cost of avoiding using efficiency as opposed to having efficiency as one of the arrows in your quiver, then you're going to start to see, I think, legislators, regulators, policymakers, those people who are at the utilities and those people who regulate utilities, those people who are in the market, all of us figure out what makes the most economic sense. So that, I think, becomes the critical issue. So I guess if you were to encapsulate that long rant into one small tidbit, I would say, don't make enduring constraints or policy rules before we start to see what the economic realities are going to be out there. Flexibility means nothing if it doesn't mean that over time, as we start to see and it starts to be revealed to us how cost-effective efficiency can be, if we don't allow ourselves, all of us, to be able to invest in that.
Other comments? So one thing we haven't really talked about, we've just talked about energy efficiency generally, and I think there's an assumption when you do that, you're talking about demand-side management kinds of issues and behavior change, new technology. Sure. But it's also energy efficiency to create power more efficiently. Yeah. So we haven't talked about CHP, and maybe we talk a little bit about that and how this can be a driver and how you see that playing into the suite of energy efficiency technologies that states ought to pursue. You want to start, Diane?
I'll just start, and I think the same way that Jean did a bit ago, which is yes. I mean, all of these technologies have to be considered if they can produce the result that we are looking for and have to be on the table. And if that's a resource, again, we talked about the different parts of the country. If that's a resource that you think you have in your part of the country, then you ought to have that tool in your toolbox as far as going forward. And again, it gets back to all of this needs to be subject to rigorous EM&V, because at the end of the day, this is about getting those reductions and making sure that we get those reductions. But that being said, we shouldn't count anything out in moving towards this.
Thank you. From a regulator's perspective, how are you all approaching CHP in the state of Ohio?
Yeah, so I would agree with what Diane said. If in the event that we are able to utilize it within our state implementation plan, we'd be very happy. I think I stated in my opening that CHP and waste energy recovery, these are programs that Ohio recognizes, and in the event that we're able to utilize them, we'd love to utilize them.
Okay. Good. I'm looking over some of the questions from the audience. One, it says that frequent criticism of energy efficiency measures is the upfront cost to low-income areas. Can you discuss methods used to finance these costs? Do you want to start, Jean, with what you all have done out in California?
Sure, I'll start. I was a member of California's Low-Income Oversight Board, and also I ran efficiency programs. We looked at the low-income residential community the same way we looked at the very small business community, which is to say, these are folks who the economic argument of efficiency, just make this investment and it'll be fine. It doesn't work as well as it might in other markets because of, quite frankly, the lack of capital to invest in things that aren't the health, safety, comfort of your family in your home. Mm-hmm. So in California, the approach uses, this gets a little geeky, but it's a direct install approach. Yep. We work with the regulators to come up with what's an acceptable amount of investment to make for those people in the low-income community. Then you define what the low-income community is, put some parameters around that, put some parameters that take a look at what's fair to the other ratepayers who are paying the price of these programs, and we just implement a program. And you'll find that one of the things, and I just want to weave this last point in, one of the things that energy efficiency does that you see stark and clear in the low-end community is it creates jobs locally, it helps people to reduce their energy bills locally, which puts more money back in the economy. It creates, I'm going to use your word, capacity building, not just at the commissions, but also in the community, so community-based organizations, and et cetera, that deliver these other programs. So I would say that in the end, what you're going to find is that in the low-income community, I think it's wise to take a look at those jurisdictions that have taken a different approach to serving the needs of the community, because in the end, if you're looking at GHG emission reduction, it doesn't make sense not to pursue cost-effective approaches, no matter if it's a rebate approach or a direct install approach.
Great, and I would note to that the ERA funding funded about 650,000 homes across the United States, low-income homes, to be retrofitted, and the average savings per family was $437 annually, so very significant. Let's move on, because we only have about 5 minutes left, and a couple of questions I think are interesting. This question from the audience is, can state 111D implementation plans credit energy efficiency investments that are not undertaken through state or utility programs, and should they? So thinking about aggregators coming forward with energy efficiency improvements, should state implementation plans allow for those types of reductions in energy demand to be counted? Awesome.
Sure, I would say yes. If we're able to utilize those programs within our state implementation plans, and it helps us meet our necessary reductions at the end of the day, then yes, of course, there are issues. Kind of the devil's in the details, and so there are issues with potential double counting and these types of things. But my general answer, without knowing sort of how the details of that would look, would be yes.
Diane, I'd be curious, because you've worked for a utility and the utility industry. How do you think they would feel about these aggregators coming forward?
Well, you need to set up the framework for it to happen, but I think that is certainly possible. You don't want to leave it on the table if it's out there by letting somebody own it. But again, with the issues you talked about, you need to set it up in a way that you are maximizing it. If we monetize this and there's value associated with this, there may be others who want to play it. But I do believe that we can set up a framework so that we can take advantage of all the different ability there is out there to gather that.
Huh. This is called Stump the Panel question here. It's a good one to end on, right?
Wow.
I abstain all the
We just send it down to Jean.
Yeah, well, let's ask it, because I think it's very interesting, and I'm sure one of these folks, they're hard to stump. We'll have an answer for it, and then we'll let people have maybe a last word if they haven't gotten to say something they think important for the audience. So here's the question. Given the wide range of GHG emitted per kilowatt hour of electricity produced, how is GHG credit from energy efficiency to be determined? For example, is a kilowatt hour saved in Kentucky, which is where I'm from, coal country, more valuable than a kilowatt hour saved in Iowa, which is wind country? And they picked Diane's home state there. So anybody want to take a whirl? So it is really, should you value greenhouse gas emissions differently based on where they're coming from? Gene?
Utilities are already doing this across the country. Utilities look at their resource mix. They look at the attributes of the efficiency program. Is it saving a kilowatt hour in the middle of the night? Or is it saving it whenever your peak is? Or is it saving it as a baseload resource? Or are you calling on it as conservation at the right time, which is a lot more like demand response? So these are not stumpers. I would argue it's just that this has been such an arcane part of the utility industry that people don't know about it. But there are very cool people with plastic pocket protectors sitting in the bowels of every utility in the United States of America who do that kind of calculation and figuring out what's being impacted in the resource mix is part and parcel of what they do.
But so if you had an aggregator, then part of the parameters of that would have to be valuing the efficiency
Right.
based on where that's coming from. So do you think that's because you said this is an arcane part of the utility industry that air regulators get this? Or is this something they need to be educated on? And Gene Fox is laughing at that one, so.
I mean, I just think that as a regulator, as a former regulator, I would have needed to be educated on the Clean Air Act and how that works. I think it goes both ways, and that there's a tremendous amount of education, and not just education about what it is, but how we do it, how we value it, all of those things we need to talk about.
Awesome.
I abstained before the question was asked. I'm gonna hold to that position.
So we're probably running out of time, so let me just ask if there are any thoughts from the panelists that they have that the questions haven't teased out that you want to leave the audience with. Gene, you want to start? We'll move
Sure.
on.
Let's make a big splash. Let's not try to be tidy. The thing that I think that worries me the most is that when a lot of very smart, well-meaning people from the economic regulation side of the world are talking to smart, well-meaning people from the environmental regulation side of the world, that at the state level, we're going to try to do this in a way so that there's no leakage, that we prove 100% additionality, we do this and that and the other. That is absolutely the wrong way to achieve the overarching objectives of 111D. What we need to do is to be comfortable with the fact that if we fish broadly with a net instead of tiny little hooks with one wiggly worm on it, we can achieve an awful lot with energy efficiency and do it in a way that is cost efficient for our consumers and to allow the states to be able to meet their obligations.
Great.
I think that's the one thing we need to take away from here.
Diane?
And I'll kind of build on that. I think once we start doing this, it will be one of those things that it will grow exponentially, and that people will not understand what difficulty we had in putting this into the mix to begin with as we get the experience with it. But my message to this body is that we have spent time and built the capacity. We just have to bring that forward at this time.
Great. And as usual, the last word's left for the regulator. Sir?
Thank you. I began with very selfishly advocating for a few items with the EPA on behalf of my state. And I really think, and this was mentioned in a previous panel, as state regulators, we have been charged with protecting the reliability of power for our consumers. And for me, that's really what it's all about. Resource aside, for me, it's about reliability. What happened during severe weather events over the past year, at least in our RTO, is very well documented with the polar vortex, 40,000 megawatts of forced outages. These are all items that have to be taken into consideration. The spot market for gas was very, very high. There are still issues that need to be worked out for gas to be the primary fuel source, and we're rich in gas in Ohio. And so, hopefully over time we can work these things out. But again, for me, reliability, affordability, these are sort of the key takeaways that I'd love for the audience to take.
And I'm going to take the prerogative of the chair and maybe add that from an energy efficiency advocate's perspective, we have a 40-year track record in this country of demonstrating that energy efficiency is our largest, most abundant resource. It can be delivered the most quickly and the most cleanly to meet our energy demands. And so we are working, and I know Rodney Sobin, who's leading our efforts on 111D, is here. We are working to ensure that states have the flexibility under the guidelines to be able to use this not only as our first energy resource, but as a first and foremost compliance strategy under Section 111D. So with that, I'd like to thank our panelists and note that they were never stumped once, and to say thank you all to you for your attention. Thank you.